All right, well, last week we met some of the women in Odysseus' life who helped to walk him back home, and they gave him a beautiful, poignant, sad kind of send-off on his way to Ithaca. But now, my friends, fellas and lads, this one's for the boys. Okay, so I said last week, I gave a little preview of this. We had almost the three races. That's not exactly who they are, but the three women who kind of bookend Odysseus' journey back home after all the shouting is over, after the tragic loss of his whole crew, when he's really been stripped down to the barest possible bones. He meets Calypso, spends 7 years with her in a kind of holding pattern, a way station. She does care very deeply for him, but ultimately he's mourning, longing, desperate to get home, and she has to let him go. Then, once he makes his way out, he finds his way to the Phaeacians and to Alcinous and Nausicaa, and that's where he begins to reintegrate into society. Civilization, which he's been searching for this whole time, keeps coming up on new islands, new places, trying to find a group of people that will honor guest friendship and Zeus and really respect some of the basic principles of civilization. Now he has the ideal of that in front of him with the Phaeacians. They're a sort of utopian society or civilization, but he has to let that go too. They have to let him go. And finally, he meets his real divine match in Athena, who meets him on the shores of Ithaca and kind of smacks him into shape, whips him up into readiness. She disguises him, as I said last time, turns him into an old beggar so that he can perform one last grand trick, a kind of wily sort of subterfuge. He's going to use now his abilities sort of for good to spy on the suitors, to figure out what the situation is and decide how he's going to make his next move. But there's another important thing that Athena does, which we didn't talk about last time, and it's that she disguises not only Odysseus to his home, to the people of his home, she also disguises Ithaca for Odysseus, so that Ithaca looks different to him. And there's an important symbolic meaning here, I think. There's some key to be aware of, that Odysseus has changed radically and will be unrecognizable to those who welcome him back home and to everybody that's waiting for him and been longing for him all these 20 years. But home has also changed. Ithaca has not been stable or static this whole time that he's been away. Time hasn't left Ithaca untouched either. And so there's actually a double disguise here that he's going to have to now work his way toward. This is the final task for him to uncover or unveil not only himself to Ithaca, but Ithaca to himself. And that's why I was talking about last week, can we ever really go back home? Yes, we can return in some sense to the places of our origins, but we have to do it by working through all of the changes that we live through in time. And so now that I've talked about these women that sort of shepherd Odysseus home, I'm going to talk about the boys, the men, the guys, and I say this really, it's the male characters, because there's one character here that isn't even human, but there is a kind of welcoming party or a set of stages he has to go through in order to be received by the men who have been waiting for him as well. So I'm going to talk through three male characters that help Odysseus to make his way back home and to plan his recovery of his kingdom, his kingship. But first, I have to announce the answer to the question we've been chewing on for a week, which is, where in the world is your favorite neighborhood book bro? And the exciting reveal, the exciting answer to that question is, I am here at New College, Florida, in their gorgeous podcast studio. This is a totally new thing that I've just been visiting them for this whole week, been doing some talks, some events, and now I'm going to be filming Young Heretics from here, which is awesome. I'm going to do this semi-regularly now. You'll see me in this new studio, not at my home in Nashville, but here in New College, because I've been involved, some of you guys know, I've been involved with New College in a number of ways now. I've been teaching an online survey in Greek literature, which has been so much fun, such bliss to get back into teaching, which I haven't done since grad school, and to engage with students directly through that means. But now I'm actually coming out here to see what all of the fuss is about. New College is a place that has been very much in the news. I imagine that if you pay any attention to politics or to education or to whatever, you've seen a lot and heard a lot about New College. It was a subject of a lot of the discussion of Ron DeSantis and his plans, and more generally the kind of conservative movement to revitalize education. And now that I'm here, I want to tell you guys a little bit about what's actually going on here, because whatever team you're on, whatever political side you're rooting for, it can get really easy to get wrapped up in media narratives, and even well-meaning media narratives, even virtuous and good media narratives, can distort a little bit of the reality on the ground. And real life is always, I think, more interesting and more beautiful than the high anxiety politics that we like to talk about when we fight about these things online or on radio shows or whatever, and you get people grandstanding and all of that. What is actually happening here is that this very beautiful campus has been revitalized by a new influx of people. You know Chris Rufo's been involved. You maybe know that Mark Bauerlein has been doing a lot of events out here. And so it's easy to think of this as just a kind of conservative enterprise and movement. And there are a lot of conservatives involved that I think are really awesome. But there's also faculty that was already here before New College became a thing in the news, who are really skilled, really talented, really devoted to their subjects. And more importantly, insofar as this is a conservative endeavor, it's only a conservative endeavor to bring back the classic mode of education, which is not actually a form of political indoctrination. This is not a case of conservatives coming in here and trying to overturn, a basic general ed course and ban the books they don't like and only, teach the books that are good for conservatives. That's actually not what conservatives want. That's not what the people who are involved in New College want, and it's not what New College is about traditionally. Instead, what's going on here is you're seeing the flowering of a real liberal arts education. They had an event that came out recently with Bill Nye the Science Guy, whom some of you may remember from science class in maybe middle school or high school, and Michael Schellenberger. And it was about science and whether science can save the world or not, and what it would mean for science to save the world. And they're doing this series of Socratic lectures, dialogues, that's going to include viewpoints from every possible angle. People that would never be allowed or accepted in some of the, big famous brand name universities. People like, I think Steve Saylor is going to come and talk, but also folks that are more on the left, folks that are more in the center. And what do you know? Wonder of wonders, it's an honest-to-goodness, open society university where people are trying to discuss ideas and learn the truth in the context of our traditions, in the context of the canon, and in the context of the great literature that I teach on this podcast and that I teach here. This is not some kind of political grandstanding project, and that makes it actually much more exciting and cool to me. We had a really awesome event last night with Mark Bauerlein about Stoics and Epicureans, and which kind of philosophy is most modern, which of these two philosophies maybe has the best insight for how we should live today. And it was just a beautiful crowd, a wonderful chance to kind of speak openly about things that really deeply matter. Because I always talk on this podcast, about truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters. And I say that because I really do mean that behind all of the media hype, behind all of the politics, behind all this stuff that we get so head up about and so dramatized about, especially during an election year, behind all of that, what matters more than anything is how you and I ought to live. There's this wonderful G.K. Chesterton line that nothing is more extraordinary than an ordinary man and an ordinary woman raising an ordinary child. And I think truly that all the other stuff, all the politics, all the fights we have, all of the disputes over, how to run the country and all of that, it's meaningless unless it ultimately shakes out in terms of human people like you and me cultivating virtue and seeking to flourish and thrive. And these great ideas, this long tradition called the Western tradition of disputing and discussing, ancient philosophy all the way up to the modern day, that is the best technology we have for resolving and discussing these sorts of questions. What is really going on at New College is that this is a place where people can do that in the best old model, not with a political agenda, but simply with a hunger and a desire for the truth and for excellence. And I'm really stoked to be a part of it. I'm going to drop a link in the description of this episode to just ncf.edu is where you go to check it out. If you are thinking about where to go to college, I know a lot of my listeners are at that stage, and I know, a lot of my other listeners are parents with kids, maybe thinking about where to send their kids to school. I get a lot of questions like, what are good colleges to go to? I would really encourage you to add New College into the list of schools that is really a top priority to look at and to consider for your application and think about going to, because it's got a great kind of personalized faculty to student attention. There's a really great faculty student ratio that enables a lot of personalized attention. And I really just think this is one to watch along with some of the other schools that I have endorsed and recommended in the past. So very happy to be here at New College. As you can see, they've got this very cool media studio that they're using to do some of their own podcasts, and they're allowing me also to occupy and take over for the Young Heretics project as part of the Young Heretics empire. And I will be doing more episodes from here as well as from my home studio in Nashville, Tennessee. So with that, let's get into it. Let's get about the business of the Western canon and reading the great books. As I said, we're kind of on this journey through Odysseus and the Odyssey and, leading Odysseus back home to Ithaca. We've met some of the women that guide him home. Now we're going to meet some of my all-time favorite characters, starting with Eumaeus the shepherd. And a lot of people have a lot of affection. If you've read the Odyssey before, you probably have a lot of affection for Eumaeus. And this is the swineherd, actually, not even the shepherd, but the swineherd, who has been longing all this time for his master to come home. And we have to confront here something that we've dealt with before on the show, which is this issue of servitude and slavery in the ancient world, because now, of course, we have the scars of chattel slavery behind us, and we, I think, have accepted, decent people generally have accepted an argument that slavery is never justified, that there's no such thing as good slavery. And that's why it might be good here to think more about servitude and think in terms of households. Because in the ancient world, where slavery is everywhere, or servitude of some kind is everywhere, it's less about are we going to have servants or not, and more about what is the right and just way to incorporate servants into your larger oikia, which is the word in Greek for household, but it's also where we get our word for economics. And so you're talking here about Odysseus as the patriarch, the master, the lord of a household that includes his blood relations, his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. So not only his blood relations, but his relations by marriage, his parents, but also those that are under his care more generally. And it's understood that although he has authority over all of those people, and although the man that's going to be leading this household has authority over all those people, he also has enormous responsibilities towards them, obligations towards them. And the society is so constructed that he could fulfill those obligations or not. It's sort of up to him. But there is still a set of values about whether he's a good man or a bad man, depending on how he treats his servants. And so now we're starting to meet in Eumaeus, we're starting to get a picture of what kind of lord of the house, master of the house, Odysseus was before he left, and what kind of master of the house he's going to have to be. And that's why it's really significant, actually, that Eumaeus knows a very different Odysseus than we know from the Odyssey. This whole time I've been saying that, we meet an Odysseus in the Iliad who can be quite harsh with his underlings and even impatient or unkind toward them. And one of the things he's had to learn gradually is how to steer a crew rightly and justly, not weakly, not just bending over backwards for everything they want, not just being the nice guy all the time, but in a way that acknowledges their contribution, that is responsible to them, that doesn't just treat them as kind of chattel, but actually, how do you lead a crew well? That's been one of the major questions in Odysseus' mind, and I've been suggesting that in order to do that well, he has to shake off the atmosphere of war. During war, things get ugly, there's things you have to do for the sake of expediency that you wouldn't wish on anybody. And so he has to make his way back to the kind of leader that can run a household, including the servants that work on his grounds. And in Eumaeus, we realize that actually before he left for war, Odysseus was good at this. He was a good master. And in some sense, what he has to do now is not so much transform into something he's never been before, but recover his earlier self in the person that he now is, which is, again, an act of homecoming. It's not that he's going to give up his memory of the war. It's not that all of that is going to disappear into nothing. But he does have to recover the kind of person that he was when Eumaeus knew him, because Eumaeus is now laboring under the terrible oppression of the suitors who give this negative, ugly picture of what it looks like to mistreat a household and to misuse its resources and to disrespect the people who care for the grounds and for the resources of the house. We see in the suitors what it would be like to do that in an evil and ugly way. And now we see in Eumaeus that Odysseus was once a better man than that. In fact, Eumaeus is so longing for Odysseus to come home that he's not even allowed himself to keep up hope. He's trying very hard to resign himself to his new situation that he is sort of attached to these grounds. And really the place that would perhaps, the point of cultural reference that would perhaps be best for us to think through here is the groundskeeper on an English estate, who is in turn himself sort of the inheritor of a tradition that goes back to feudalism. He's sort of the last vestige of feudalism, where the lord rules over an estate, parcels it out perhaps to some of his underlings, and then those underlings kind of manage and rule over a bunch of fiefs, that is, people who work the land for him. And again, this seems brutal to us now because we have the blessings of capitalism and we have the ability to run our own households and nobody has to work the land in this way. But in the context of a feudal world, it's possible to have better and worse versions of feudal leadership. And similarly, Eumaeus is kind of like this groundskeeper. He has love and affection for the land, for the household, and even for the son of the house, Telemachus, and the lady, Penelope. He's attached, both economically and personally, emotionally, to this household. But he is therefore now stuck with the grief of being badly lorded over by the suitors. He doesn't really have a choice. The flip side, the negative underside of this, is that he's got nowhere else to go as the leadership decays and deteriorates. And so Odysseus is seeing now in Eumaeus some of the wound that has been left by his absence and some of the responsibility that he now has to set his house in order. And we get this through a very moving set of scenes in which Eumaeus is talking to Odysseus without realizing that he's talking to the master he's been longing for this whole time. This is the guy he's been waiting for, and he can't recognize him. Odysseus, of course, knows, and he's dropping all sorts of hints. He even prophesies his own return. But this is a form of what you would call dramatic irony, where we know what's going on, some of the characters know, but other characters are speaking in ways that are more significant than they know because they're sort of shielded from a certain amount of knowledge. And it's also a version of a kind of scene that we get throughout literature. We had one kind of scene that's sort of everywhere in literature earlier, if you remember the episode on the underworld and talking to the spirits of the dead, that's a scene that gets repeated throughout the tradition of epic and so on and so forth. This is another type of scene that we get in many other places, and it's the scene of the god or the hero in disguise. And often it is a god that will put on a disguise and look like a low-status person, look like a beggar or an old person or whatever who needs care and protection. And it's kind of a way of testing the mortals to see if they operate according to virtuous principles even before they know that they can be rewarded for it by heaven. So there's a part of the Jason and the Argonauts myth where this happens, where Hera pretends to be an old woman trying to cross a stream and Jason helps her, and that sort of shows him to be a good guy, shows him to be a hero. There's the story of Baucis and Philemon, who are this old couple visited by a god in disguise. It's not limited to Greek literature either. We get in Abraham, the story of Abraham, who entertains the three angels who come to his tent, and he offers them food, and they kind of represent God, or they are envoys, messengers from God, or perhaps even from the Trinity. There's a story in East Asia, it's part of Japanese lore and elsewhere, called the Moon Rabbit story, where the moon god travels in disguise looking for food, and it's because the rabbit throws himself on the fire to offer himself as food that he gets to go up and live on the moon forever. And so we have all of these versions of this. And I think the reason why this is an idea or a motif that haunts us in not just the West, but in the world more generally, is expressed by Paul when he says in one of his letters, let the love of strangers flourish, for in so doing some have entertained angels unawares. It's the idea that in our daily lives, in the things that seem most ordinary to us, there is a disguised spiritual truth and significance. So you feel like you're just giving a stranger a crust of bread, you feel like you're just letting somebody stay the night in your house, you feel like you're just making dinner for your spouse, whatever, the basic things of life that look to us so ordinary. If we could only see them for the reality of what they are, we would understand that there is a heavenly logic at work here, and especially when philoxenia, that is the love of guests and the openness to people you don't know who can't necessarily reward you, that spirit that allows the divine into your life because you are living your life as if you are a host for people in need, essentially. And in this case, it's not the gods that are being hosted, but the master of the house, who is like a kind of little godhead within the house. And Eumaeus is the classic archetype of the good guy. He repeats the thing that Nausicaa says about strangers being from Zeus. And it's even more poignant now because he's talking to a stranger who actually is the answer to his prayers. This is the guy that he's been waiting and longing for. And he makes a wonderful speech that I think is really significant for us, because remember, we've been tracking this whole time this question of Odysseus' identity. Who is Odysseus? How can he be recognized? And what is his true character and nature? And Eumaeus is the one who gives us, I think, the first positive image. We've had a lot of negative images. Odysseus is not going to be the guy that goes and sleeps forever with the nymph and just abandons his home. He's not going to be the guy that abandons himself to drugs or to drink, whatever. And he's been stripped down to the guy that just wants his home back. But now we get a positive image of who that guy could be, how this veteran coming home from war can find meaning and purpose and honor in the small daily tasks where we entertain angels unawares. It's very beautiful, and it's especially beautiful because Eumaeus thinks he's mourning something that will never come back again. So once again, I'm translating myself here. We're in book 14 of the Greek, and this is my own translation of what Eumaeus says about Odysseus to Odysseus without knowing. He says, "No question he died out there and left behind grief for his friends, for all of them, but for me most of all. There can be no other. I'll never find a more gentle lord wherever I go, not even if I went all the way back to my father's and mother's house where I first came to be and they raised me up themselves. Even their absence hurts me less badly, much as I long to see them with my own eyes in the fatherland of my birth. All the same, I'm gripped by a longing to see him return, Odysseus. Oh, but I can't, my visitor, call him by name in his absence. He cared for me with such heartfelt love. For that, I will call him my honored friend, though he's far away. And it's these last lines that really matter, I think. I mean, it's a gorgeous speech altogether, but this idea that Odysseus is sort of his surrogate father. I long to see him even more than I long to see my parents, but I can't, my visitor, call him by name in his absence. We've had this really subtle and careful literary artifice here on Homer's part, which he often will do this, that he'll use the word ton as it's a pronoun that is him. Ton menegon oxena ka u pareonton amazdein. Ide omai. And so ton, him, is the direct object here of this sentence. I can't call him by name in his absence. We've had a repetition of this word, ho, or ton in the accusative, and it comes back again and again, and it's like him, and we're sort of wondering, who is it? Who are we talking about? He does name him, right? He says it's Odysseus, Odysseus, pathos ainutai o humanoio. It's desire of Odysseus coming home, but then he pulls back and goes back to this pronoun, this sort of gender, this vague, male pronoun. Ton menegon oxena. Him, I am ashamed to call him by name. I'm almost not worthy to call him by name. Ton menegon oxena kai u pareonton amazdein ide omai. And that ide omai begins a new line. So we have this careful construction here where it's him, O stranger, and he doesn't even know that O stranger is him, is the person. And then even though he's not here, which in fact he is, on Omazdein, to name him, I am ashamed, ide omai. And so I've translated this as, I'm gripped by a longing to see him return. Oh, but I can't, my visitor, call him by name in his absence. I don't feel worthy. He cared for me with such heartfelt love. And so this is, I think, I'm trying to preserve in the translation something that's there in the Greek. I can't, my visitor, call him by name. It almost feels like he's saying, I can't call my visitor by name, because he can't, because he doesn't know who this guy is, that this is Odysseus sitting right in front of him. But in his absence, I will instead call him honored friend. And this is, I think, the first positive answer we've had to the question, who is Odysseus? Because remember in Phaeacia, with Alcinous, he said, I am Odysseus. That is, he claimed his name back. And the question is now sort of, who is that guy going to be? And the answer is, he is Eumaeus' honored friend. E itheon kaleo kai nos phineonta. Even though he's far away, I call him my honored friend. And this is the first sort of positive quality that attaches to this name, Odysseus, that he can't even say because he's far away. But now here he is in front of him. You can almost feel him ready to break down in tears. But that's not going to happen quite yet, because the real moment of breakdown, the real catharsis, is coming when Telemachus arrives back home. So we have to wrap up this story of Telemachus. The whole poem began with 4 books just about Telemachus and his coming of age and his desire to see his father again. This void in the house, this absence in the house that has particularly weighed upon his son, because of course fatherless sons are in this awful predicament of needing to take up their manly responsibilities, but having no role model, or not having the best possible role model there, which is your father. And so Telemachus has made the best of a bad situation. He's been coached along by Athena in the guise of Mentes, that is the mentor, and she has basically spurred him on to a quest, his own coming-of-age quest, first of all, to take some degree of control over his house. He's asserted his authority even over his mother, which you may remember from those episodes. And then he's struck out in search of news of his father. And when we last saw him, he was in Sparta. He was in Lacedaemon with Menelaus and Helen, and he had made that journey to find news, which he finally did get, the whisper of a hint that maybe Odysseus is coming back home. And so now we're kind of cutting back to that. We get that narrative picked back up so that we can close out that part of the story too. And it's Athena, again, who stands before Telemachus' bed as he's sleeping, kind of in this dream state, and says, it's time to go home. You can't just stay here the whole time. It's time for you to return back home. And it's on his way back to Ithaca that Telemachus arrives at Eumaeus' hut, where he finds his father, his dad. And in Eumaeus' absence, the two of them have this conversation mediated by Athena, where she takes the disguise off. She comes as a beautiful woman. There's a really cinematic moment where the dogs recognize her, even though not everybody can see her. Telemachus can't see her, but she shows up as a beautiful woman. The dog recognizes her, and she takes off Odysseus' disguise. And Telemachus is his father's son. This is one of the most touching parts of this exchange. He doesn't believe at first that he's looking at his father. He's not going to allow himself to believe. In the same way that Eumaeus can't allow himself to believe this stranger's predictions that Odysseus is going to come back home, Telemachus can't allow himself to believe that he really is looking at his father in the flesh. It's too much, too good to believe, and I think he doesn't want to be disappointed. This is a dynamic. I've actually been talking to some friends about this dynamic a lot lately, and maybe it's because of the presidential election coming up that people have hopes and fears, and it's very hard to know how to navigate, how to manage your emotions rightly in the face of very intense high hopes and fears. I don't think we can help hoping. And when you see a result, let's say in the polls that you're excited about, the temptation is to say, no, I'm not excited. I'm not going to get excited. I'm not going to allow myself to get excited, because then I'm just going to get disappointed if it doesn't turn out to go my way. And this is a very human impulse that we have to kind of pull back from our hope and from our excitement. And the problem with this, I think, and this is, I think, part of what Telemachus is realizing here, the problem with this is that it doesn't really work. The crash is going to be there. If you really are hoping for something, if you have an indication that something might be what you've hoped for, you really can't stop yourself from hoping. You can't stop yourself, and it's dishonest not to acknowledge that, yes, I have a hope for something going well in the future. I mean, maybe you've applied to a college and you're really excited and you're really hopeful that it's going to go well. The temptation is to say, no, I'm not hopeful. It's not real. It's not going to happen. I'm just going to choose to believe that I'm not going to get in so that it'll be a pleasant surprise if I do get in. I'm going to choose to believe that my candidate won't win so that it'll be a pleasant surprise if he does, but I won't be disappointed. It's a way of shielding yourself from the pain of human life. There's two problems with this. One, it's dishonest. One, it involves inventing an emotional state that you're not actually in. And the other is that I don't think there's anything we really can do, ultimately, to shield ourselves from the vulnerabilities of being human. I actually think that's just part of living the life that we live, is that some things go our way, some things don't. And in order to embrace life in abundance, to really live fully, I think you have to allow for the disappointments of life. You have to acknowledge and be honest about, I really hoped that this thing would happen and then it didn't. Now, does that mean that you have to take your hopes as reality? No, there is an other kind of extreme where we hope for something and then we become such optimists that we really believe, we convince ourselves that we can put it out into the universe through sheer affirmation. And we're like, yeah, I'm going to win, right? We're so back. And we say like, yeah, it's definitely going to happen. And then our hope becomes a propositional affirmation about the future. So instead of being in a state of hopeful anticipation, we end up in a state of delusion of the other kind, not delusion of denial of hope, but delusion of pure optimism, that everything is really going to go great. And this is a recipe for disaster because, again, it's dishonest. It's not the reality of what's going on as you truly see it. It's your vision clouded by your hope. It's wishful thinking. It's all of that stuff. And so the trick here, and I think Telemachus is learning this now, the trick is to live fully in the honesty of everything that you're experiencing, including experiencing your hopes as hopes. You can actually say to yourself, not this thing that I hope for isn't going to happen, but this thing that I hope for might happen, and I really hope it does, but also it might not. And if it doesn't, that will be sad, and I'll deal with that when that comes. But this is, I think, a really much more healthy and honest way to deal with what's going on, is to live in the reality of your hopes as hopes. And Telemachus here is kind of resisting that because he really doesn't want to be disappointed again. But the thing is that his next reaction, the next thing that happens, shows that of course he was hoping. Of course, in his heart of hearts, that part of himself that he won't admit to himself, of course he really desperately wants this to be his father. And you can see that in the way he reacts, that he can't help but long for this and hope for this. Because here's what happens. It's a gorgeous example of the Homeric simile. Again, I'm translating for you here this meeting between Telemachus and Odysseus, when Odysseus finally says, like, it's really me. And having finished his speech in this way, he sat, and with that, Telemachus slumped in his father's arms and sobbed, face streaming with tears. Cries of their longing for one another burst out of them. More keenly and thickly they cried aloud than a flock of birds, their voices like those of the taloned vultures whose infants are snatched up by the backwoods farmers before they're fully fledged. In just the same way they grieved, and their tears were soaking their cheeks. They could have gone on and on like that, sobbing all day until sunset. Man, I mean, it is a heartbreaking and beautiful picture of a father and son reunited. And there is a line that when Telemachus starts to cry, the verb that's used is very similar to the verb that we get when mothers or spouses, wives, fall onto the corpses of their dead husbands in war. He pours himself, I've translated it as slumped in his father's arms, he pours himself onto his father, collapses at last with all the pent-up tension and everything he's had to keep back and keep in as he strives to be the man of the house. Now at last his father is here. He slumps his father's arms and sobs. And then we have Huphimeros, amphiterois detoisen Huphimeros ortogooio. That is the cries of their longing burst out. They rose up almost spontaneously out of both of them. And now they're crying. It's very reminiscent, actually, of the encounter between Achilles and Priam in a very different context, when Priam, the king, is trying to get his son back from Achilles, the corpse of his son back from Achilles. They weep with one another with the full overwhelm of all the emotion. And here, too, everything that has passed between them and in their individual lives over these past 20 years is just like laid out here, like birds crying over their lost children. I mean, what an incredible, it's obviously, this is often how Homeric similes work. It kind of links these two things with a tactile or a sensory experience, that is, their cries sound like the cries of birds, but then that whole image brings with it all of this other richness of the loss and the longing of a young infant lost before he could even fly, before the bird can even fly. And of course, that's Telemachus was just a little baby when he was left behind, but now, they're reunited as grown men. And you can see in this, of course, everything that Telemachus was trying to keep back, right? The reason that this is such an enormous outburst of pent-up emotion is because Telemachus has been in this position until this very moment of just not allowing himself to hope. And some amount of that was probably a healthy, in Telemachus' case, probably a healthy defense mechanism. At a certain point, after all these years, you would think like hope might be crazy, and there have been people who have told him hope is crazy. And yet he can't stop himself from hoping, especially now that he's got this news, from Menelaus and from the from abroad, from his father's comrades in war. He's got this news that maybe his father is alive. So of course there's been this agonizing hope building up in him, and he hasn't known where to put it. And now we see that it was there all along, even as he denied it. This wonderful reunion scene. But there's lots of work to do, because the next thing they have to figure out is how are they going to overthrow the suitors who have basically colonized the kingdom of Ithaca. And that's a story for another day. That's going to be our next, and I think our penultimate episode on the Odyssey. Next week, I'll talk about how they overthrow the suitors, but they have to strategize about how they're going to do that together, which means going back to the household and checking things out, getting the disguise back on, looking like this old man so that nobody recognizes him and everybody underestimates him, and all the suitors are going to think he's just a vagrant and a nobody. But now Telemachus knows, and so father and son can scheme together. And having myself a father with whom I'm very close, I have to say this is one of the greatest joys of a father-son relationship, when you reach a certain age, when you become an adult and you and your dad can plot stuff together. I think dads kind of wait for this moment all along. Odysseus has been waiting for this moment, of course, in absentia, as he's been journeying and traveling. But the moment when a father and son can actually kind of stand on similar footing together and plan a hunt together, or plan a trip, or with my dad, I've been doing this Substack with him with the New Jerusalem, and the fun of planning that together as two adult friends as well as father and son is like a true joy. So there's a restoration here. We're going to talk about how ugly it has to be next week, how ugly it is when they overthrow the suitors. But there's also, and we would be amiss, we wouldn't be getting the poem fully if we didn't grasp the spirit of reunion here and the vigor and the vitality of father and son getting back together and scheming now how they're going to trick the suitors and overthrow them and get the house back in order. So all of that is coming down the pike. But first, I said this was for the boys. I said it that not all the boys are human. Not all the fellas are human beings. Some fellas are not human beings, but still deserve entry into the Bro Hall of Fame. And we cannot conclude talking about the Odyssey without talking about Argos. And maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but this is one of the great dogs in all of world literature. If you want to know where the impulse comes from that leads to Old Yeller and to Lassie and to all of these stories of faithful dogs that, wait and give their lives for their masters, that type of scene too is prefigured here. We have man's best friend and this dog Argos who has waited along with Eumaeus, along with all the other guys, along with Telemachus. I mean, these are all the guys, his crew, that he left behind that have been just waiting for their chief, their captain, to come back home. And we saw it with Eumaeus in that he was waiting for Odysseus, or he needed Odysseus in order to live his fullest life, right? To be a servant in a good and righteous household. Telemachus obviously needs his dad, needs his father if he's going to come to man's estate as fully as possible. Now we're meeting Argos, who has not been able to do anything but languish without Odysseus. This is this dog, this fine and beautiful dog that was a puppy that has now reached old age but has been waiting faithfully for his master to come back and refusing to die until his master comes. So if this isn't a tearjerker, then I don't know what to tell you. I'm actually reading this really interesting. So Argos is such a beloved character for those in the know. Like real ones know Argos and love him. And he was such a beloved character that the New Yorker actually printed an excerpt from Stephen Mitchell's translation of the Odyssey. Stephen Mitchell, his translation of the Odyssey is not my absolute favorite. I really love his translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if you're looking to read that poem, you definitely should check that translation out. But I did want to read this translation that Mitchell had published in the New Yorker because he does a great job with Argos. And really any translation would be good. But usually I redo my translations. Every now and then I want to give you other people's translations so you can get a variety. So here's Stephen Mitchell in book 17 as they encounter Argos outside the palace. As they spoke, a dog who was lying there lifted his head and pricked up his ears. It was Argos, Odysseus' dog. He had trained him and brought him up as a puppy, but never hunted with him before he sailed off to Troy. In earlier times, the young men had taken him out with them to hunt for wild goats and deer and hares, but he had grown old in his master's absence, and now he lay abandoned on one of the heaps of mule and cattle dung that piled up outside the front gates until the farmhands could come by and cart it off to manure the field. So this is a real, Argos is in a sorry state. He's been abandoned and neglected. This is a clear case of animal abuse. And this is where Odysseus questions Eumaeus about, what is going on? This looks like it could be a beautiful dog, but I can't tell if his looks were matched by his speed or if he's one of those pampered table dogs, which are kept around just for show. Eumaeus says, this is the dog of a man who died far away. If he were now what he used to be when Odysseus left and sailed off to Troy, you would be astonished at his power and speed. No animal could escape him in the deep forest once he began to track it. What an amazing nose he had. I'm thinking here of Where the Red Fern Grows, if you've read that book about dogs. It's kind of commonplace, a truism, that if there's a story about a dog, the dog is going to have to die at the end. And I hate this. I hate it because I hate that dogs don't live as long as we do. And I hate that there's no such thing as a good dog story that doesn't end with the passing away and the tearjerker scene of the dog dying. This is Old Yeller. This is Marley and Me. This is every other great dog story. Always ends with this because that is a core part also of the human impulse to care for things, right? This is really all about these stories about the son and the swineherd, and now the dog, right? This is really all about the people in Odysseus' care and how he can do right by them after his long absence. And with dogs, with animals, we know it's like, they're not people. They're not the same as children, so they don't get the same honor and respect, and they don't have the same value in reality or in our eyes. But they do deserve, I think, a degree of love and care from us. And this is something that we can miss when we get kind of down on. I mean, there is like this extreme environmentalist version about how animals are like just as good as us or whatever. That's not true. But if we toss that out the window, we can't lose sight of the fact that animals do have a degree of soulhood, right? They have a degree of consciousness, sentience, intelligence that deserves our honor. And the fact that they have smaller lives than us is part of that. Bringing a dog rightly through all of its life is part of that story, which is why good dog stories do, I think, have to end with the death of the dog, because we have to process that as part of our obligation to them. And so they have this conversation about the dog. Odysseus sort of salutes him. He can't greet and ruffle the fur of this dog or love up on him the way he might like to, because he has to maintain his disguise. But here's the real thing. With these words, he entered into the palace and went to the hall where the suitors were assembled at one of their banquets. And just then, death came and darkened the eyes of Argos, who had seen Odysseus again after 20 years. The dog recognizes him. He's one of the very few creatures and entities among the people who have been waiting for Odysseus who see through his disguise. We're going to meet another one shortly here in a future episode. But I just think, the humanity and the detail and the sophistication of this moment, and just the heart-rending kind of precision, exactitude where Homer knows that this faithful dog recognizes his master. I wonder even if the idea is kind of that he recognizes his master by smell. I'm not sure if that's not really in the text, but I like to think that like the dogs have these great noses, so he sees Odysseus, for who he is, and kind of notices that and knows now that he can go. It's time to go. Lassie is on his way out. Oh man, and it chokes me up a little bit, I have to confess. So that's kind of setting up the scene now. Now we've walked Odysseus through kind of his re-entry, and we have the ghost of a plan taking shape. We have, what was the thing that Trump said at one point? We have outlines of a plan or something, when he was asked about how he's going to overturn Obamacare or how he's going to deal with the healthcare crisis. He said, we have outlines of a plan. Odysseus has outlines of a plan now, and now there's something taking shape about how he's going to overthrow the suitors, retake his rightful place at the head of this household. And we've also seen that he's needed, that they need him there, and that he is equipped for this. He can do this. He has the skills and the talent. He just has to re-access that memory, and he has to bring it to bear on the man that he now is, with all the sad wisdom of his journeys and all of the trickery he's had to indulge in and engage in. And so he has to incorporate his trickster self, his polytropos, his self of many ways. He has to re-funnel that back into his role as master of the house. There's one last battle ahead of him, and of course, one last encounter with his wife that we have to get to. And then we really will be done. We will be at the end of our long Homeric journey. I've decided that I am going to do the Aeneid next. You guys all basically asked for that when I said, what should we do next? But I'm going to take a little break in between and do a few other things. I think I'll probably do the Socratic dialogues, the tetralogy of Plato about the trial and death of Socrates. I may throw in a few other things in there, maybe a little Beowulf for good measure, and then we will embark upon another deep dive, this time into the Aeneid, which is going to be really, really fun. I don't know if you guys have any experience with the Aeneid or not. I love that poem. It's the first major work that I ever read in the original Latin. And I read it for, an AP class in high school. So I have a lot of affection for it. But it's actually really good that we've spent all this time with Homer before we move on to Virgil and to the Aeneid, because the whole epic tradition, of course, is inspired by Homer. And much of the literary tradition in the West besides is inspired by Homer. And you will now be able to recognize references to the Homeric poems all throughout modern literature and pop culture. And one of the best things about studying this stuff is that you can understand the kind of language of reference and metaphor that is being used that harkens back to sort of foundational works like the Iliad and the Odyssey. But this is especially true in the case of Virgil, who is basically trying to one-up the Greeks. This is the Augustan age. It's a new birth of Rome where they've been through the terrible turmoil of the civil war. The Republic is over. Now Octavian, that is Augustus, has become emperor, and Rome needs a new story about who they are, where they come from, where they're going. And this is this founding epic that Virgil composes about the refugee from the Trojan War, that is Aeneas, the prince of Troy, who has to find his way to Rome. But of course, there's another reason to link the story of Rome to the story of Troy, and that is to connect the Roman story to this grand universe of myth and legend that the Greeks have been steeped in for centuries. What Virgil is really trying to do is get in on this cultural tradition, because the Romans, despite their great technological aptitude and their incredible military prowess and all of the political innovations that they made, they always had a bit of an inferiority complex about their culture and about their literature. This is sort of like how America can sometimes regard the British. You've noticed probably that if you watch a movie, the English character is often either the villain or the sort of sage wise man, and in either case, he's brilliant. He's so smart and cultured and cultivated, and that accent is so great, right? That's a little bit like how some Roman gentry, how some of the elites in Rome might have regarded the Greeks, that they have all this philosophy and this mythology and this literature, and Virgil is trying to get Rome in on that, which means that he basically creates a little mini Homeric epic. And I say mini because it's 12 books long instead of the 24. But it's not mini in one sense, which is that it's sort of a mog. It's sort of a brag for Virgil to say, yeah, I can do in 12 books what it took two 24-book epics to do, because the whole poem is sort of split up into a little mini Odyssey and then a little mini Iliad. And it's very carefully designed, really, to depend upon the Homeric epics and then to outstrip them. And that is going to be a major part of the epic tradition going forward, is this one-upsmanship. So it's really good that we know what Virgil is working with now as we talk about the Iliad, as we move on to talk about the Aeneid in a few weeks. But it's also good because, of course, the movie is coming out. And we are now in the portion. I think these last episodes have been about the part of the Odyssey that this movie with Ralph Fiennes will cover. I don't know, but it seems to be about Odysseus' return home. And so now we're also learning kind of what this, what the raw material is, what the source material is for this movie, and whether it will be any good. And to that end, I have a mailbag question this week about adaptations. So mailbag questions come to me through Substack, rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You can DM me there, write in however you want to ask mailbag questions. Free and paid subscribers both can get in touch with me this way. This is a DM from Lillian. And Lillian writes, "Holy smokes, epic is so good." All capital letters. You have truly added to my life by telling me about it. So this is another adaptation of the whole Homeric saga, and he's still working on it. This guy, Jorge Rivera Herons is his name. And he is still working out the last few sections of this giant musical version. It seems to be not a staged musical, but a concept album, like a kind of pop musical version. I actually really hope, it's been wildly successful, and I really hope it makes it to the stage at some point, this musical version of the Odyssey, because the songs are so good. There are so many little Easter eggs that you will now be able to recognize after listening to this show. And as Lillian says, it's just like a really cool way to get more familiar with this material. It is also an adaptation. And so in any adaptation, it's not that you have to recreate the thing exactly, it's that you have to figure out a way to be true to the spirit of the thing in the new medium and with this new genre. And so here's what Lillian has to ask. She says, "I have listened to all of what is released so far, and it has been stuck in my head since. My question is about the theme in epic of ruthlessness. Odysseus becomes more and more ruthless as the plot goes on." This is true. There's sort of a leitmotif, how does a man become a monster? Like there's this whole sort of like thing that keeps coming back about Odysseus losing his humanity as he has to face down all of the trials and torments and the terrible choices that we've been talking about. Odysseus becomes more and more ruthless. and becomes the man turned monster. This is how he gets home. You talked about how Achilles becomes a monster in rage in the Iliad. Now in epic, Odysseus becomes a monster in desperation. It's how he gets home to Penelope and Telemachus, but he's no longer the man they knew. Is this good? Is this just the price you pay? Is ruthlessness mercy upon ourselves? I mean, this is a wonderful question, and this is the set of questions that I think the musical version in epic does raise these questions about the text. And if you've been following along the show, you'll know that I have a slightly different, it's complementary, but a slightly different reading of the poem and how ruthlessness figures into Odysseus' journey. I think that Odysseus does have to make use of a ruthlessness that he learned in war. And this is also kind of made clear in epic as well, that it's in war, and especially in the actual sack of Troy, when he has to decide whether or not to kill the son of Hector to keep him from avenging his father's death, that Odysseus begins to think like, war is forcing me to become a kind of person that could never kindly and well rule over a household. That in order to get back to my home, I have to become a guy that is just grotesquely ruthless, as you say. And how can that guy ever be a loving husband, a loving father, a loving master over his servants, all of these things that we've just been looking at? And I do think that this is exactly the question that the poem poses. I actually think that some of Odysseus' quests force him to strip away that ruthlessness, that he's not always, I mean, sometimes he does have to be cunning and canny, and he has to sacrifice the lives of some of his men. But one of the things he learns is that he ought to be less ruthless, less hard-headed if he wants to keep some of his men. So I talked about, in the case of the cattle of the sun, it's because he doesn't let his men in on that, and because he's a little bit too hard-headed about that choice, that his men cease to trust him because he doesn't tell them what's coming up, and he's not honest with them, he doesn't talk about it clearly enough. And so I think, there are cases in which we have no choice but to be ruthless. And that's part of the story, definitely, and something that epic really gets, is that there are situations in which we have to make terrible trade-offs, like the Scylla and Charybdis choice. And there's no option that doesn't involve awful and probably unbearable moral compromise. Sometimes we are placed in that sort of situation, and then we have to learn to live with whichever choice we have made. But there is also a way in which making those sorts of necessary choices can corrupt us morally. And I think that the musical is kind of dealing with that too, that once you end up in a situation where, I have to do this terrible thing, I have to kill this person or else, so many more will die. I have to vote for this guy, even though he doesn't represent my principles entirely, whatever. It gets really easy once you're doing that. It gets really easy then to just get addicted to ruthlessness for its own sake and to give in to your lower impulses, not because you have to, but because now you're hooked on them. And that's, I think, what Odysseus is faced with, is that he needs to channel sometimes his ruthlessness. He needs to weaponize some of his more cunning and sly abilities. He has to mobilize and use the uglier parts of himself in order to do a good thing, which is get back home and restore order to Ithaca. But once he gets there, he has to bring that ruthlessness back under his control and not let it run away with him. And so, he has, Heron seems to feel, and we'll see how he brings the conclusion of this home. Heron seems to feel that Odysseus does lose control over that ruthlessness. And the question I have is whether when he finishes this version of the story, he's going to give us an Odysseus who has brought himself back under control and has restored some of his humanity through the journey back home. But I'm really excited to know. I think he's working on a part of the musical called the Vengeance Cycle right now, or the Revenge Cycle. I'm going to keep watching him and see kind of how he does it, because this is sort of an open question now in the way that he tells the story, but I definitely think these are the themes that the poem is dealing with, and my own take on it is sometimes you have to be ruthless, but then you have to resist the temptation to be ruthless for its own sake, and you have to bring the darker sides of yourself, and you have to bring the terrible necessities that you face to heal under a larger project of goodness and virtue. And that's really Odysseus' challenge. All right, send me more questions. I love to answer them. rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. It's been getting awesome feedback so far. I really love the 5-star reviews you guys have been dropping. Please do drop a 5-star review on Amazon if you've got a moment. It can be a sentence or two long just to increase the visibility of the book. And check it out if you haven't already. It's available wherever books are sold. And of course, there will be links here in the description of the episode. Next time, we will return to Odysseus, talk about how he treats the suitors and indeed the serving girls, who some of whom have been disloyal to him as well. Things are going to get hairy. Talk about ruthlessness when I see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.